burnout has been such a huge topic in the last 12 months in radiology, and we are very aware that burnout is one of the greatest challenges facing our industry at this point. So everything that we can do to keep people motivated and engaged and, happy and contented to be at work, I think is not just beneficial for them personally, but beneficial for the company and ultimately for our patients as well.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Radiology Report podcast, where we are having conversations with the leaders transforming radiology today. You can find us on radiologyreportpodcast.com, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google, or wherever you get your podcasts. I'm your host, Daniel Arnold. Today, we are joined by my good friend, Dr. Catherine Jones. Dr. Jones is a cardiothoracic radiologist trained in the UK and Canada, and working in Australia with I-Med Radiology. She has an interest in development and validation of AI tools as diagnostic assist devices in radiology and the use of AI in medical education. She's a professor of clinical imaging science at the University of Sydney. Her clinical interests include occupational lung imaging, specifically in the areas of silicosis and other pneumoconiosis. How do you say it?
Perfect. Pneumoconiosis.
Pneumoconiosis. Catherine, as my friend, put that in there to trip me up and embarrass me on my own show.
Right at the end.
We'll
Thank
get
you for
into your
having me,
background in
Daniel.
a second, but
Thank you.
you and I go way back for our listeners. Years ago, you came and trained in Cincinnati for
I
a
did.
few weeks, and we got to know each other's families, and it was a delight having you over in the US to train with Dr. Pomerantz and the team there. And then we've partnered together for a number of years building education programs out for the I-Med Radiology Network. So we go way back, and it's a pleasure to, we finally got to see each other after many years in person at the last RSNA. So it's great to see you. And I'm so happy to have you on the show today.
Thank you. Well, thank you for having me, Daniel. It has been a long time that we've known each other, and it was wonderful to see you at RSNA and just being able to sit and chat, and talk and, all of the things that we've always had in common. And, the time that I spent in Cincinnati was a really wonderful learning time for me. And that was really when I think we kicked off the collaboration between your modality and I-Med. So there's been a lot in the last couple of years, obviously, for everybody, but really useful time, I think, for a lot of us to get going on some of these projects, which I think would be a really interesting, hopefully an interesting episode on the podcast.
Awesome. Well, we'll get into all that in a bit, but first, I wanted to have you on the show really because I think you have a very interesting career, and I think our listeners would love to hear about it. You, in addition to many of your clinical duties, have maintained an active academic career and entrepreneurial career as well. And so, would love to hear a little bit about how you've built your career, how you think about projects and what you're interested in, and what role you're playing in driving the field forward. But take us back to the beginning. How did you end up in radiology?
Oh, it's going back a few decades now, Daniel. So I think when I was even back at high school, I realized that I didn't want to do something that was just the standard cookie cutter career in medicine. So before I did medicine, I had degrees in maths and physics, because that, I think, was really what I was most interested in. But I wanted to do something that had involvement with people. So, a really patient-centered or, person-centered career. So I switched over and I did medicine after that. And I guess part of my passion or my drive was to make medicine more evidence-based, because, having degrees in statistics and, I wanted to be able to use those skills to be able to improve the decision-making that doctors and other healthcare professionals have in their day-to-day practice. And that's pretty much underpinned the following 22 years since I finished medical school. I went to the UK a year after I finished my medical school training, mainly just to see the world a little bit. I'd grown up in Australia. I hadn't traveled all that much. And I thought I'll go over and spend a year in the UK. And I was very fortunate that I started working at a big teaching hospital in London in cardiac surgery. And I ended up staying in the UK for nearly a decade. So I started off doing 4 years of surgical training and then switched to radiology. And I really switched knowing that I'd always wanted to do radiology as my subspecialty. But I had a bit of fun in the surgical training program for 4 years first. And while I was doing that, I was very lucky that I was able to be part of the research team at Imperial College London. And that really gave me lots of opportunities, not just for my clinical career, but also to establish more of an academic career as well. So that's kind of
So
how it
I've
started.
always known that you were into education. I don't think I realized just how into education you were, that you did basically 2 full residencies. That's wild. And so does Australia, is it set up such that in Australia you can go train in the UK, you can go train in Canada, and then you can actually practice in Australia?
Well, so no, not really. I would say I was a bit of an anomaly. I was an Australian medical school trained person who'd gone overseas to do my residency in radiology in a different country. And when I decided after I went and did a fellowship in Vancouver in cardiothoracic, I then decided to come back to Australia, and it meant that I had to do my radiology boards in Australia when I got back, which thankfully didn't take very long. And then I was kind of a free agent, and I could, you know, be a fully qualified board certified radiologist here in Australia. So that it was a bit of a convoluted pathway. And when people find out that I trained in the UK, but I sound very Australian, there's always a little bit of a confused pause. And then there's a very quick summary as to how it happened. And it is an unusual pathway, but I'm really glad that I did that because it gave me the experience of working in multiple different hospitals in different healthcare systems. I think that perspective of having seen how other regions and other people do things does certainly allow me to use some of that experience to see how things could be improved or done differently in other places.
What were the major differences, if any, that you saw between the UK and Australia?
I think one of the biggest differences is that in Australia, we have a really almost even mix of public and private healthcare. So we have a public health system which is free for everybody who lives here. So if you're in a car accident or you have a heart attack or a stroke, you go to the public hospital and you will be very well treated at no cost as an Australian resident. And it's supported, if you like, by a private healthcare system where if you want to do something which is elective or semi-elective, it might be quicker to go privately. And a lot of the family doctors and certainly radiology is done in the private sector for all of the things that you don't need to go to the hospital for, like you have a sore shoulder or you have, a twisted ankle that hasn't quite gotten better. You don't really need to go to the hospital for that. So there's a really good balance of hospital sort of publicly funded services and then a really strong private sector as well, which is also underpinned by government funding with Medicare. So that is a real difference to the UK, where at least when I was there, almost all of the healthcare was delivered via the NHS, the National Health Service, which was very hospital based. And then even the family doctors were sort of part of the NHS. It was all one big system, which is starting to change now with some increasing privatization in the NHS. So it was a very different environment. It was a great learning environment in the NHS. There's lots of volume, there's lots of variety in training cases. And I was very lucky to be able to do nearly 10 years there.
Thanks for that, painting that distinction. It seems like Australia is a little bit of a middle ground between the UK and the US in many ways.
In many ways, I agree, yes.
So in Australia, is it most common for radiologists to be, 100% private, 100% public, 100% mixed? Like, what's the most common for folks?
It really is widespread. So we do have radiologists that are 100% of their time in the public system. We have radiologists like me who work in the private system, and then we have quite a lot of radiologists that might do a few days in public and then a few days in private every week. It's interesting
So it's not
because quite a few.
mandated. It's not
No, not at
mandated
all.
that someone be working in the public sector. Got it.
Nope, nope. Once the training is finished, you're able to choose. The interesting thing is a lot of our public hospitals are privately run from the radiology perspective. So even though I work for a private company, I actually work in a couple of our public hospitals here in Brisbane where I live. So I do still get the case mix of, a huge variety of patients coming through the public system, as well as, the private sector, which, gives me a different perspective and a different part of radiology practice. So for me, I find that very rewarding.
That's awesome. So what led you to I-Med Radiology? How long have you been at I-Med Radiology? Maybe for those who don't know, what is I-Med Radiology?
What is I-Med? Yes, it's a
And
great question.
how has the organization evolved? Because it has, evolved considerably since I've gotten to know the organization. We've been partners now for 5 years. So talk us through it a little bit.
Sure. Well, so I-Med is one of the world's biggest private radiology companies. We have over 400 radiologists and we have 250 clinics across Australia. We are constantly expanding. We are the biggest provider of regional radiology in Australia, so outside of the big metropolitan areas. It means that we have a really wide geographic footprint. Obviously, Australia doesn't have the population that the US does, but it has almost the same landmass. So we have the geographical challenges of providing a service across a huge continent, but we also provide the breadth of imaging. So we provide full radiology services, interventional services, nuke med, the full works. It's a very interesting place to work because of those challenges and because of the leader profile that we have in Australia as the largest provider of radiology services. So I started at I-Med when I came back to Australia from Canada from my fellowship, and there was an opening for an overseas radiologist in Tasmania, so that little island off the southern end of Australia, and I took that. I thought, I've never been to Tasmania. It sounds like a lovely place, so we moved there, and I was there for 5 years, and it was a lovely place to live. I had my 2 children were born there, and then after a while, I thought I probably should consider, heading back to Brisbane, which is where I grew up, where my family and most of my long-term friends were. So we ended up moving back there 6 years ago. But I stayed within I-Med, and I could, switch between the Tasmanian clinic campuses up to the Brisbane campus, and it was a very smooth transition.
When you joined I-Med, do you remember how many radiologists there were in the network?
I think there were 200 and something. It's an interesting situation because, as we've said, a lot of radiologists in Australia do a mix of public and private. So when we talk about how many radiologists, we talk about how many full-time equivalent radiologists we have. We actually have far more than that. And we also have a very strong teleradiology business that covers, multiple countries. And, there's a lot of radiologists that are involved in that as well, which I'm not counting as part of the number. So it's a constantly expanding group, it's sometimes a challenging situation because, you find a radiologist, I'm not sure I know you. Have I met you before? I only started last week. Oh, that would be why. But equally, we have a really good core, group of radiologists that have been at I-Med for a long time and, have tried to lead the company in the last 4 or 5 years, particularly over the pandemic. Obviously we had the same challenges that the rest of the world had with, staffing and resourcing and, planning for the worst in terms of the clinical outcomes. So, it's been a very interesting time, but you're right. I-Med has expanded. It's become a real leader in global radiology. It's been really nice to see, actually. Yeah.
It's very cool. And I've loved watching the organization grow and evolve. And one of the things that I know, one of the roles that you played early on there was how to bring education and quality into such a big organization. It can be really challenging as you grow to maintain high levels of quality, to invest in people's professional development. Talk a little bit about how you got involved in that, what types of initiatives that you've taken on, and what sort of problems you set out to solve. You mentioned at the jump your interest in math and science and bringing a statistical mind. Radiology is so cool because you really can look at these things as you've got people doing a task 15,000 times a year, so you can get some good data on on performance. So talk a little bit about that.
Sure. Yeah. So probably around 4 or 5 years ago now, the senior leadership team at I-Med made a priority of helping particularly our more junior radiology colleagues to upskill in the sorts of parts of radiology that they weren't feeling as confident in as they might want to be, particularly transitioning from residency in a public hospital to a private setting. So the Chief Medical Officer, Dr. Ron Schneer, he and I first engaged MRI Online to try to provide a service to help us, particularly in the field of MRI, but then increasingly in other modalities as well. And that really led to a company-wide subscription to the service, but also a more broad sort of understanding that we'd like people to do a broad range of radiology, but there are some fields of radiology which, if you don't do a lot of, can be quite challenging to maintain skills. For example, reading mammograms, if you don't do a lot of them, it's easy to de-skill. So we've established quite a few programs now within I-Med for either people who are specialists to maintain their skills or people who are general radiologists to upskill in particular areas. A nice example of that is prostate MRI has become far more utilized here in Australia in the last 5 years. And we've upskilled, I think, 30 or 40 of our radiologists now to be MRI prostate readers across our group, which, in certain geographic areas across our network, there was a real need for that. So, constantly looking to see how people's skill sets could be improved, that they have an interest and are keen to improve on that. So that's really been the first part of the education piece. The second piece about quality is about maintaining peer review, maintaining peer audit, having a robust, interesting cases environment so that people are encouraged and feel comfortable to ask for help from their colleagues. That's a really important part of radiology, particularly, when we're all becoming more used to, remote working. Being able to still feel part of a team and being able to ask colleagues for help is a really important part, not just of maintaining clinical quality, but maintaining job satisfaction. Burnout has been such a huge topic in the last 12 months in radiology, and we are very aware that burnout is one of the greatest challenges facing our industry at this point. So everything that we can do to keep people motivated and engaged and, happy and contented to be at work, I think is not just beneficial for them personally, but beneficial for the company and ultimately for our patients as well.
Great summary. And as I understand it, a few thoughts here. One, I-Med has been leaders in peer review. For those not familiar with the Australian context, I believe peer review is just becoming mandated either soon or just recently. But you guys have been sort of a step ahead of that, thinking about, how to do this because
That's
it's the right thing to do.
It's because it's the right thing to do, yeah.
And sort of extending beyond just peer review, but peer learning and mentorship and sort of creating these programs at scale. And one of the benefits, I think, of these larger groups, I think sometimes larger groups can have, at least in the US context, people can be a little bit afraid of the larger groups. But one of the things that I've seen a benefit of is you can take on new skills and you can change career paths and you can find new opportunities within this broader network. And so there's been a lot of doctors who hadn't read MRI before, and then you guys invested in them and their ability to become now, proficient in MRI, or they wanted to have a new opportunity in a different region of the country and there's opportunities there. And so the ability to invest in people's professional development is really interesting. I think the other benefit is one that you've certainly benefited from, which is you can have a multitude of interests. As I understand it, you're no longer 5 days clinical. You fill your week with, an array of different activities. One of which, beyond your clinicals was helping start a new company, Annalise.ai. For those who don't know, can you tell us a little bit about Annalise.ai? Interesting. Would love to hear the elevator pitch, but how did you get involved? What was the 0 to 1 on, hey, I know how to help here?
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. So it's a very interesting story. Annalise.ai is a medical imaging AI company. It's co-founded between I-Med and a software engineering company based out of Sydney called Harrison.ai. I think I-Med is one of the lead players in radiology, particularly in, Australasia. Was very much a discussion for quite a long time that we didn't want to be reacting to developments in AI. We wanted to help drive it and shape it. We sort of had a bit of a responsibility to do that. So starting this company, it was an interesting starting point. The chief medical officer of I-Med came to me and said, "Oh, we're looking at doing this AI initiative. We'd like to have a clinician to help with the first, kind of startup part of this process, particularly, we may start with a chest X-ray product. Would you be interested in advising and consulting with them? And I said, that sounds really interesting. I already have an interest in AI. One of my expertise areas is diagnostic testing methodology. This sounds like a perfect match for me. And he said, oh, well, just take a few weeks. And I said, oh, yeah, I don't think so. I think this will take a bit longer. And that was just over 3 years ago. So I've been very lucky that I've been able to be involved with Annalise. There's a huge team of very talented people at that company. And, I've been able to help them with the clinical application of the products that we make, and then to help with the validation of those products. And then obviously the next stages of that after we have regulatory approval is to implement. And so one of the big success stories, I guess, that we've been really happy about at Annalise is the fact that it's been adopted at such scale across Australia and now starting across Europe. And then for the last couple of years, really looking at the US situation with regulatory approval with the FDA, which can be quite challenging, as anyone who's been involved in this process with the FDA would acknowledge. But, really good success in terms of initial approvals from the FDA for our chest X-ray product, and now well along the way for our CT brain, a diagnostic assist device as well. So that's been a huge learning curve for me, not having previously worked in medical devices, but really, I think a good mix for me because, working out evidence generation for regulatory approval, but also to demonstrate the, post-implementation benefits in clinical practice about quality improvements, about efficiency improvements, all of those things that we as radiologists, we need. We need all of these things to help us get through the increasing workloads and the increasing demands on our time. So it's been a great mix for me to bring all of those parts of my previous life together into, the AI implementation and product development space. It's been very satisfying.
So we'll get into the product in a second, but I'm more curious in the entrepreneurial journey as a, founder myself. And, you tell the story and it's always up and to the right, but you thought it'd take 3 weeks. It's been 3 years. What have been some of the surprises, some of the, near-death experiences or moments where you thought, oh, gee, I don't know about all this?
I think there's always peaks and troughs in terms of how busy you are when you're doing this sort of journey. Certainly, I think sometime last year, I remember thinking we now have, real traction on our FDA clearance strategy. And, we have a lot of work going on in that space. We also are developing a new product. So there's a lot going on there as well. And, for 3 or 4 weeks there, I was working at Annalise full time and I wasn't in the clinic. And somebody said to me, oh, have you jumped ship completely? Have you, gone down the rabbit hole of AI? And I did sort of stop for a moment and think, oh, have I? No, not yet. No, I'm still being a clinical doctor too. And then, of course, once those sort of big projects kind of, slow down again, you still can step back and have a little sort of chance to breathe and relax again. So it can be quite intense in terms of the number of hours in the week. But Annalise, it's so well supported and it's grown into a really well-run and large enough company that we are lucky, which I think is one of the differences between us and other AI companies in radiology, is we are lucky that we have the resources to bring in people into the team at the appropriate moments, to scale up to where we need to be, as a global company. Obviously, we're based out of Sydney in Australia, and, it's difficult to be running a global company out of Australia. And so we have offices now, in the US and across Europe and the UK and across Asia as well. So, we've been very lucky that we've had the opportunities to bring on really good people in all of those areas and across all parts of the business. So it's been amazing to me to see the expansion and just to see all of the wonderful new people that are coming in, to pick up the baton and keep going, and help drive the success of Annalise. So that's been
I understand I understand Annalise raised $100 million not so long ago. This might have been a little before the economy turned, so the timing was probably pretty good. Shore you up for some time. But, other than capital and resources, what sets Annalise apart from the pack?
I think one of the really key aspects for us is that it is very clinician-led. We have a really big clinical input into everything that we do. We don't want to make products that we make because we can. We want to make products that actually address a problem or a need that the clinical users have. That's always been our remit. We try to make products that are comprehensive, and then the user organization can decide what to do with the really wide, comprehensive outputs that we produce. For example, our chest X-ray product, it outputs 124 different findings. Now, that's not available in the US, unfortunately, at this point, but we are able to look at other ways of helping. For example, can we use this really wide range of findings to start doing automatic report generation? And you may not agree with it. You may need to change a few bits and pieces, but it means that you have a report that we know will be accurate, in the vast, vast majority of times, which for some users around the world who are really resource stretched is a really amazing tool that they can use to get through their work. It means that more patients can have their imaging done, and it means that the urgent reports can come out faster. It also means that we can triage things a lot in a much more sophisticated way. You can ask, okay, I'd like to have a list here of cases that look like they may have cancer on them, or a list here of all of the cases that may have some of the trauma findings on them. So it means that the users or the organizations that have our product can have a far more nuanced sort of interpretation of our outputs and can use it in a variety of different use cases. But all of that comes about because we have many clinicians in our teams, not just radiologists, but also emergency doctors and other, healthcare professionals, radiographers as well, who can approach every step of the radiology journey for that patient from the moment of the request through to the report being issued to say, well, where are the sticking points? How can we use our technology to help this process along using the existing infrastructure that people already have to make it better? And I think that that's been a really rich environment for me as a clinical doctor, being able to think about all of those potential improvements.
In the markets where you're live, what are you seeing as the biggest impact to workflow? Is it that I can now read more studies per hour because the report generation is faster? Is it that you're actually skipping a step and getting some preliminary data to the referring faster? Is it that you're just getting more accurate? I'm sure it's a mix, but in the areas where you're like, okay, this is a home run for these doctors, what is the customer saying to you about it?
It is a big mix. The biggest implementation we've had is at I-Med. We have hundreds of radiologists using it at I-Med, and we use it predominantly as a diagnostic assist. So when you open the case, you have the Annalise available to you for chest X-ray and now for CT head. And it means that we are more confident. It means that our reporting is quicker and that our reports are more accurate. Particularly in some of our sites in the NHS, they are using it to be able to triage out the cases that need to be immediately reviewed. And that can either be because there is an intracranial hemorrhage or a pneumothorax, but also looking at it to say, this patient has something that could have a lung cancer on this chest X-ray. This can't wait to be reported in a week or 2 weeks' time because they do have backlogs. This needs to be done now, and then we can tell the patient now whether they need to have a CT scan. So, streamlining particular, niche cases has really been of great interest. And I think the lung cancer detection on the chest X-ray, because we know that delay in the diagnosis, treatment, biopsy and everything can really lead to a functional decline in that patient, over a series of even 3 or 4 weeks. So those sorts of use cases. And ultimately, we're starting now to see more and more health systems and insurance companies wanting to say, well, can you give us an idea about what's the prevalence of these particular findings in our own patients so that we can help decide how to allocate resources moving forward in a more informed way. And of course, when you produce such a comprehensive list of outputs, we're able to not just look at the acute things like the trauma, but also some of the more chronic findings that may, of course, lead to more uptake of health resources down the line. So yeah, I think it has been a mix. Initially, it was about assisting people when they do the reads, and now it's really becoming about triaging cases more effectively, more safely, producing reports for people to be, a little bit faster, and then really into more population-based medicine.
I just think about in my own work, anytime I can edit a document, I am much faster than if I have to write the document from scratch. I always tell that to my team because sometimes they'll send me a document and I'll tear it up. But it was very helpful. It's much easier to edit something than it is to write something from scratch. And it was
Absolutely
90% them, and I just, you're able to move so much more efficiently that way. I think radiology is learning that they can be very much the same way, and having some pre-populated ideas and conclusions can be hugely efficiency gaining, whether it be AI. In some contexts, it might be a PA or an extender, which is extraordinarily controversial in the US. I don't know what it's
or a resident or somebody
or a resident,
doing
right?
most of the work for you.
Less controversial. But one of the things that my wife is in training in the hospital she's at, their chest X-ray volumes are so big. It's a subspecialty academic program, but everyone has to pitch in on the chest X-ray volumes, which
that's right.
I don't know what the economic model is like in Australia, but the economic model is completely upside down in the US, where you get paid a few dollars an X-ray, and certainly losing money on every one that you read, yet the volumes just continue to go up. And so it's not a great place for anyone to be in. At the same time, radiologists don't want to cede any turf on it. So I don't know how it all plays out, but I think everyone's waiting for the AI that you're talking about, I think through Annalise, to play a big role there.
Yeah, no, and we have the same situation here. Chest X-rays, we probably do between 5,000 and 8,000 a day across the I-Med network. That's a lot, and that's a lot of radiologists sitting and reporting chest X-rays. So if we can have people reporting these lists, particularly separated out into the urgent cases versus the more normal or unremarkable cases, and then having pre-populated reports, it makes the reporting process safer. It also makes it quicker. I do have to point out, you still need to look at the actual picture. So I make that caveat every time that I look at this. We remain responsible as the radiologists, but it is very important as well to acknowledge that there's a lot of small times throughout the day, 1 second here, 3 seconds there, 10 seconds there, that when you add up all of those little tiny inefficiencies that we have, it adds up to a big chunk of our day. So making our workflow more streamlined, it means that we are less tired at the end of the day, having done the same amount of work. Or when we have backlogs, it means that we can do more work and still go home at the end of the day, mentally okay and refreshed without being too tired. So, yeah.
Well, I've always felt like, I thought you described it well. I haven't heard many people talk about AI as medical device, but it is. And I've always thought of the investments in AI to be more akin to a pharma level investment than a SaaS, software, sort of typical Silicon Valley venture style investment. And so you're seeing that now, where companies have, started to raise 100 million or more, and they're just getting into commercialization, which is much more similar to, sort of the pharma med device level investments, where, hundreds of millions raised over a decade of, data and validation and clinical studies before you can really get to a place to have the widespread impact. And so it's great to see Annalise sort of there to fight another day. Certainly the next few years will be an interesting time for the company and for you and the team. So how do you do it all? How do you balance all of these interests? And I think one of our core audiences is sort of the resident, fellow, early career radiologist thinking about, how do I want to shape my career, and what's important to me. And so any final advice that you might have for young radiologists out there?
Yes, I don't consider myself a young junior radiologist anymore. I'm probably in the middle part of my career. But I would say that no work that you do early in your career is ever wasted. So if you get involved in a project, do the best job you can, because radiology is a pretty small world. And just walking around RSNA last month, and I must have run into a couple of hundred of people that I knew, that I'd worked with before or that I'd had interactions with before, just walking around the exhibition hall and through the lecture halls. And all of those networks and connections that I've had in the 20 years that I've been a doctor, and even in fact, some of my medical school friends that I still have the pleasure of working with today, none of that is ever wasted. So, first of all, be a good person. I think that's a really key principle. Treat people as you'd like to be treated yourself. They won't be forgotten. The second principle is, work hard and do the things that matter and do a good job on things, because again, that won't be forgotten. If you have an interest in something, particularly something which is innovative or novel, put your hand up and have a go. You don't have to be a world expert on something to say that you're interested and you'd like to help. And that's how people get into new areas and new activities. That's a really key thing, is just having enthusiasm and willingness to learn and willingness to accept that no matter what stage of your career you're at, you may start something new. You're not an expert. Keep your mind open, and the opportunities and the rewards will come. And it's all about lifelong learning. We're all staving off dementia and trying to maintain all those neuronal connections within our brains. So, do something new, challenge yourself, put your hand up and get involved. And soon you'll find yourself with so many opportunities that you have to choose which ones you want to do the most. And that's where I am at my career, and I feel very fortunate. I'm also very fortunate that my husband is a stay-at-home partner who is very supportive of my career, and that my children have no insight, but they think I'm the best doctor in the world, and they're so proud of everything that I do. So, I have a wonderful balance. Even though my work is busy, my home is busy, it is balanced out, and I'm very, very lucky to be in the position I'm in.
Well, that's great advice for a radiologist at any stage of their career. And also, I think we found a new slogan for my company, MRI Online: stave off dementia. So thank you,
That's
Catherine,
right.
so much for the time. This was
Oh,
a
thank
ton
you,
of
Daniel.
fun. And, I love hanging out with you, and I can't wait to see what you do next.
I will. Thank you. And thank you for having me on. And hopefully we get to see each other in person again soon.
Yes. Thanks for listening to this episode of the Radiology Report podcast. Be sure to visit us at theradiologyreportpodcast.com or subscribe to the show wherever you get your podcasts to join us for our next episode. We are always looking for great guests. If you have someone you'd like to hear on the show, please get in touch with us online.